In this video, I'm going to go over the 12 cranial nerves, and I'm also going to trace some of the arterial supply of the brain that we can see on this gross specimen. I'm going to go over some of the components of the circle of Willis after I do the cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves are the 12 nerves of the peripheral nervous system that are emerging from the foramina and the fissures of the cranium. Their numerical order is determined by their skull exit location from rostral to caudal, even though cranial nerve 12 in the gross specimen here seems a little bit more rostral than cranial nerve 11. So remember, I said count down from 1 to 10, and then we flip 11 and 12, and I'll go back over that when I'm highlighting all the different nerves. So all the cranial nerves are going to originate from nuclei in the brain. 2 are going to originate from the forebrain. These 2 are the olfactory and the optic nerves. 1 actually has a nucleus in the spinal cord. That's the accessory. And the rest of them are all going to originate from the brainstem, the midbrain, pons, and medulla. All right, so let's begin by going over cranial nerve number 1. And as you all know, cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve. And I'm going to trace over that in red here. So this is the olfactory bulb and the olfactory nerve, the olfactory tract, going all in red here. So this is a special somatic afferent nerve which innervates the olfactory mucosa within the nasal cavity. It carries information about smell to the brain. And there's lots of branches of the olfactory nerve that pass from the nasal cavity through the cranium, but they're going to terminate in the olfactory bulb, which, as I just highlighted, is going to be continued as the olfactory tract. The olfactory nerve doesn't have a specific nucleus of its own. Instead, its cell bodies are found in the olfactory area, the nasal mucosa that covers the roof of the nasal cavity. So now let's go over cranial nerve number 2, and this is going to be the optic nerve. So cranial nerve number 2 that I'm going over here in yellow, this is the optic nerve. I am now circling the optic chiasm, where the left and the right optic nerves merge. And then going down more caudally now is the optic tract. So cranial nerve 2 is another special somatic afferent nerve which innervates the retina of the eye and brings visual information into the eye. Cranial nerve 3, the ocular motor nerve. I'm going to go over this here in green. This is the ocular motor nerve. See it really nice preserved here. And the ocular motor nerve is both a somatic and a visceral efferent motor nerve. So this means that it has 2 nuclei that carry 2 different types of efferent fibers. And as the name suggests, the ocular motor nerve is the chief motor nerve supplying the eye. It's going to originate from the midbrain, and it actually leaves the skull through the superior orbital fissure to enter the orbit, where it enables eye movement, does constriction of the pupil, also known as miosis, and is also involved in lens accommodation. Cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve, and we can see the trochlear nerve here. All of this is considered the trochlear nerve. So this is a general somatic motor nerve, and it originates from the midbrain and enters the orbits through the superior orbital fissure and supplies one of the extraocular muscles, so it plays a role in eye movement. Next is the trigeminal nerve. I'm going to go over now in purple. So a little bit more lateral here, the trigeminal nerve over here in purple. This is a mixed cranial nerve, so it contains both special visceral and general somatic fibers. The fibers originate from the brainstem, specifically from the pons, forming the trigeminal ganglia near the apex of the petrous part of the temporal bone. And as you know, the trigeminal nerve actually divides into 3 divisions. So they are 5-1, 5-2, and 5-3. So the 5-1 division is the ophthalmic nerve, the 5-2 division is the maxillary nerve, and the 5-3 division is the mandibular nerve. Each of the aforementioned nerves basically leaves the skull through a different opening. The ophthalmic's leaving through the superior orbital fissure, the maxillary is leaving through the foramen rotundum, and the mandibular nerve exits via the foramen ovale. And all 3 of these branches, they supply sensation to the facial skin. The ophthalmic nerve supplies the forehead, the orbit, and the nose. The maxillary nerve does the zygomatic region and also the upper lip, while the mandibular nerve does the innervation to the buccal skin, the lower lip, and the skin of the mandibular region. All right, cranial nerve number 6, the abducens nerve. So let's go back a little bit more midline, and I'm tracing over here in yellow the abducens nerve. So this is a general somatic efferent nerve which innervates the lateral rectus muscle. Again, that's an extraocular muscle of the eye. And the abducens nerve originates from the brainstem and exits the skull via the superior orbital fissure. The abducens nerve plays a very important role in eye movement, and that's all I really want to say about that. All right, so let's move on to the facial nerve. The facial nerve is going to be over here now. I'm tracing in blue. This is the facial nerve, or cranial nerve number 7. This is a multimodal nerve. It carries both general and special fibers. It originates from the brainstem as 2 separate divisions. There's a larger primary root that carries motor fibers and a smaller intermediate nerve that carries sensory and parasympathetic fibers. The 2 divisions leave the cranial cavity through the internal acoustic meatus, and then they travel through the facial canal. Once they're there, they form the facial nerve proper and leave the cranium together through the stylomastoid foramen. And once the facial nerve reaches the face, it enables many functions, as you know, like facial expression, and does some secretion and also taste sensation. Cranial nerve number 8, vestibular cochlear nerve. Okay, so we're going to go over this one in orange. So the vestibular cochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 8, is going to be, I'm trying to find a good, so again, I'm going to retrace cranial nerve number 7 on this side in yellow, and then cranial nerve number 8, the vestibular cochlear, is going to be this, it's kind of hard to see, but this orange region. So right below cranial nerve number 7, that's going to be the vestibular cochlear nerve. This is a special somatic afferent nerve. It's comprised of 2 parts. It has the vestibular nerve and the cochlear nerve. So the cochlear nerve, as the name implies, enables hearing, while the vestibular part mediates balance and motion. And the 2 components synapse with their respective nuclei in the brainstem, and they do a lot with hearing and balance. Cranial nerve number 9 is going to be the glossopharyngeal. So all these bundles kind of coming off right here. All this bundle coming off the medullary pyramids, this is all the glossopharyngeal that I just traced over in that dark blue. Again, this is another multimodal nerve. It originates from the brainstem and leaves the skull through the jugular foramen. It allows us to swallow, helps us with salivation and taste sensation, as well as some visceral and general sensation in the oral cavity. The vagus nerve, this one's going to be a little bit hard to see. So the vagus nerve got ripped off. I tried to super glue it back, but it's always going to be a little bit right below the glossopharyngeal. So again, I'll go back over in that darker blue on this side now, the cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal. And then the facial nerve I'll trace in, the vagus nerve I'll trace over here in purple. So look for the border of the cerebellum, and then you can usually see the facial nerve kind of traversing along the beginning of the cerebellum in this view here. So this is a multimodal nerve. It originates from multiple different nuclei in the brainstem, and just as the cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal, does, the vagus nerve also exits the skull through the jugular foramen. It's actually the longest of all the cranial nerves, and it's the only one to actually leave the head and the neck region. The vagus nerve actually travels into the thoracic and the abdominal cavities, and it provides parasympathetic supply to the visceral organs. It actually has 2 separate ganglia, and they are called the superior ganglion of the vagus nerve and the inferior ganglion of the vagus nerve. So the superior ganglion provides the fibers for general sensory function, while the inferior ganglion gives special sensory and visceral output. And as you know, the vagus nerve controls a large number of functions like gland secretion, peristalsis, phonation, taste, visceral and general sensation of the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. And this is one that's frequently tested on many anatomy exams. Hint, hint. All right, cranial nerve number 11 being the accessory nerve. I'm going to go over this one in red. This is cranial nerve 11, the accessory or the spinal accessory nerve. You can also see it a little bit here on this side. So again, this is not a perfect aligned brain because I'm holding the two hemispheres together, but this is the spinal accessory nerve. Again, this is going to be an efferent nerve that originates in the brainstem and spinal cord. It exits the skull just as cranial nerves 9 and 10 do through the jugular foramen, and it allows for phonation and movements of the head and the shoulders. The sensory fibers of the cervical plexus join the accessory nerve, which enable general sensation for its target muscles. So when you feel comfortable while you're getting a shoulder massage, you can thank your cervical plexus for that. The spinal accessory nerve is a little interesting because not all anatomists agree on exactly where the nerve fibers originate from. And as you can see, there is a little bit of discretion of whether or not cranial nerve 11 is a little bit below or a little bit above cranial nerve number 12. And then we'll finish with cranial nerve number 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve, and I'm going to go over that in green here. So the hypoglossal nerve is a general somatic efferent nerve that originates from the brainstem. It actually leaves the skull through the hypoglossal foramen, and its main function is to enable tongue movements. It's really important for smooth daily function of every person, as it plays a significant role in important mouth functions such as speech and swallowing. And similar to the spinal accessory nerve, the hypoglossal nerve also interacts with the cervical plexus. And those are the 12 cranial nerves. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to erase everything now. So just bear with me a second while I erase all the scribbles that I made on this. And I'm going to go over some important arterial supply of the brain that we can see within the circle of Willis. All right, so I'm going to begin with the internal carotid. So I'm circling it in green. This is the internal carotid artery. And then kind of traversing posteriorly, you can see this kind of traced over already in green, but this artery that connects the internal carotid with the posterior cerebral artery that I'm now circling in purple, that blue artery that I traced over, that's the posterior communicating artery. And then traversing up to the anterior part of the circle of Willis, we have the anterior cerebral artery. So remember, the internal carotid artery is part of the circle of Willis, but the middle cerebral artery, which would branch off in this way, is not. And then the internal carotid artery is also the demarcation from the anterior cerebral artery, which we see here, and the posterior communicating artery, which I have highlighted in that lighter blue, and I'm tracing over again here. And again, the purple is the posterior cerebral artery. That's right next to that ocular motor nerve. Again, the ocular motor nerve is here in yellow. And then behind the optic chiasm would be the anterior communicating artery, but we can't see that. So those are just some of the aspects of the arterial supply that we can see on this gross specimen of the circle of Willis. So I didn't cover all the components of the circle of Willis, but those are the things that we are most likely to tag.